Before we look into Israel's case and the ICJ's charge of genocide, I want to remember that this week is Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th. And in light of the attacks on October 7th and the charge of genocide at the ICJ, I think it's important to look back to history to help analyze what's happening now. We're going to look at the apathy here in the West towards the Jewish plight and towards the massacre that happened on October 7th. And we're going to look at what genocide means. If you were to go out and ask, like, man on the street style, 100 young people here in the West, I would guess that most of them would probably say that Israel's committing genocide against the Palestinians without any understanding of what the term genocide actually means. At the end of the Holocaust, the West looked around and was shocked by the horrific atrocities that occurred under the Nazi regime. And as Winston Churchill noted, the Holocaust was a crime without a name. It was so horrific, and there was no term to characterize the systematic oppression of the Jews and the extermination of the Jews carried out by the Nazi regime. And so Ralph Lemkin, a Holocaust survivor from Poland, coined the term genocide. He formed it by combining the word geno from the Greek word for race or tribe with side, the Latin word for killing. And so genocide came to mean race killing or tribe killing. And both the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide were precedent for the creation of this term and its definition. The definition of genocide was codified by the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, and is defined in Article 2, which states genocide is the intent to destroy in part or in whole a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And so genocide is different from all other war crimes in that in order to demonstrate that a country is violating the Genocide Convention, you have to demonstrate that they hold a policy of annihilation for a people in part or in whole, and that they are acting on that policy or campaign. Malcolm Shaw is an international lawyer. He's acclaimed. He quite literally wrote the textbook on international law, and his work on genocide is frequently referenced by the Red Cross. And Shaw is representing Israel before the ICJ. And in his opening remarks, he had this to say. He said, "What determines the act of genocide is the intent to destroy a group in part or in whole, and that alone distinguishes the act of genocide from all other crimes against humanity." So as he reminded the court, the ICJ is not hearing a case of war crimes, of crimes against humanity. They're hearing a case hinging on the definition of proving that Israel is committing genocide, which he proposes to the court Israel is not. South Africa has to prove that Israel is violating the Genocide Convention by coloring their intentions in Gaza in the intent to destroy Palestinians in part or in whole. Genocide is distinguishable from all other atrocities, including other atrocities that are oftentimes confused for genocide. Democide is the intentional killing of an unarmed or disarmed person by government agents acting in their authoritative capacity. So this is typically seen in authoritarian regimes. Politicide is the deliberate physical destruction or elimination of a group whose members share the same main characteristic of a political identity. So this is the elimination of a political movement. And then there's ethnic cleansing. So you'll also hear the term ethnic cleansing thrown around in reference to Israel committing genocide. Typically, you'll see ethnic cleansing and genocide in this accusation. And ethnic cleansing, a perfect example of that would have been the Bosnian War and the breakdown of Yugoslavia. And the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide is in the intent to remove an ethnic group or a national group or religious group from a territory versus the destruction of a particular group. So in some cases, ethnic cleansings and genocides happen congruent with each other, such as in Bosnia. The Bosnian War is actually not considered a genocide. It was an ethnic cleansing. But there are actually very few historic examples or precedent for genocide. We have the Holocaust that's universally acknowledged and the Rwandan genocide. We have parts of the Bosnian War considered genocide. And we have Darfur, also very universally acknowledged, at least amongst academia, to have been a genocide. But the crime is very specific. And as Israel points out, the loss of Palestinian civilian lives is regrettable and an undesirable aspect of armed conflict, especially in a densely populated urban area. But the loss of innocent civilian life is not the definition of genocide. And South Africa hasn't been able to prove Israel's intent to destroy the Palestinians, except for in referencing that 24,000 people, according to the Hamas run, Health Organization in Gaza have been killed in the crossfires of this conflict. And first, I'd like to point out that the number stated by South Africa at the ICJ is provided to us by a Hamas-run organization within Gaza who are incentivized and benefit from politicizing their death count. But on top of that, they haven't been able to demonstrate that Israel is executing a deliberate policy of annihilation towards the Palestinians, and that countries have the right to defend themselves after provocation, which is exactly what Israel points to on October 7th, saying that they are part of a war that they did not start, nor did they want, but they're responding to the acts of war committed on October 7th by a terrorist organization who, quote, whose brutality knows no bounds. And South Africa, just like the rest of the West, seems to have forgotten why we're in this war to begin with. The West calls for a ceasefire, yet fails to acknowledge that on October 6th, before the massacres, there was an existing ceasefire between Hamas and Israel that Hamas ended when they entered Israel and slaughtered 1,200 innocent Israelis and took 250 of them hostage. The aim of Hamas on October 7th wasn't to gain military control or territory. It was to rain terror. It was an act of attrition, and it was a provocation to armed conflict or to war. Of course, Israel is going to respond in self-defense to an act of genocide. At the very least, it was an act of war. But South Africa failed to mention that in their opening statements. They breezed over October 7th, and that's a posture that the rest of the world, especially in the West, seems to have taken. And I want to specifically point to the bias within the UN when it comes to the accusation of genocide, but not just that, when it comes to recounting what happened on October 7th to begin with. Because again, the UN's policy or their talking points is a ceasefire, condemn Israel's occupation, condemn Israel's human rights violations. But what about the human rights that were violated by Hamas against Jewish Israelis? There are very few people in the international community or international intergovernmental organizations calling for the accountability of Hamas, the militant terrorist who rained terror down on Israelis on October 7th. And it points to an overall cultural anti-Semitism. Because if this had happened to any other people group, the UN would most definitely be talking about it. But because it happened to Jews, well, the policy of apathy or even straight up denial has been taken by the West at large.